spare. Following Harry's recollection of his mother's funeral, he starts the next section with, "Then everyone moved on." And he talks about how people went back to work and went back to school, and he was returning to Ludgrove School in Berkshire. And he explained, and this is hardly a surprise, that if you wanted to find him back then, the library would have been the last place to look. Well, that might explain, Harold, why you didn't do so well in your examinations. And instead, he explained that he would be heading around outside. He wanted to keep moving. He wanted to keep busy. And we are then treated to a description of what life was like at Ludgrove School, where he explains that more than 100 boys lived in close proximity, sometimes 10 to a room. And we're treated to the delightful revelation that everyone knew everyone's business, down to who was circumcised and who wasn't. Well, it's interesting that you would have such a close proximity that you would know whether someone was circumcised or not. Perhaps someone was taking a rather keen interest in somebody else's genitals, or who knows, maybe it's a case if you find those things out through the daisy chain or a game of soggy biscuit. And he remembers that nobody mentioned his mother when he returned. And it was then his birthday. And he explains that he chose 2 favours because they were his mother's favourite. And he talks about getting the biggest slice of cake if you sat next to the birthday person, birthday boy. And he explains that he received an Xbox, which his mother had bought for him shortly before she died, and bought it for him in Paris. And he doesn't know whether it was true or not, but that's the story that has been touted. And he confirms that he loved video games. And he admits that it might be him that actually has brain damage. He mentions about his mother having a head injury, and he considers whether he might be the one with brain damage, and he thinks that it's a defense mechanism, that his brain didn't really record things as they once did. Now, it's interesting, of course, because we know that he's not exactly the brightest individual, but putting that to one side, it may well be the case that as a consequence of the trauma that he's experienced, he isn't remembering things as quite as they were, which is interesting that he makes that admission, because he is very zealous in his confirmation that it was the press that caused the death of his mother, and that the press were there wanting their pound of flesh. So he seems very firm in his recollections in that regard, notwithstanding admitting that his recollections of a whole weren't that accurate. There does seem to be an inherent inconsistency there. He then continues to tell us about life at Ludgrove, and explaining that there were 2 male headmasters, but it was largely run by women, and they were called the matrons. And whatever tenderness was received, it came from the matrons. Apparently, they hugged the boys and they looked after them, etc. And they basically were seen as surrogates. They were mums away from mums, apparently. And then, rather interestingly, he makes the confession that matrons were suddenly hot. And he explains he had a crush on somebody called Miss Roberts, and that he thought he would marry her one day. And then there were 2 Miss Lynns, a Miss Lynn Major and a Miss Lynn Minor, and he was smitten with the latter. Now, it's hardly a surprise that a teenage boy is developing a crush on a slightly older lady, and for him to admit this, although it might seem a bit strange to some to think, oh, you're admitting that you fancied your matrons, seems to me entirely appropriate. That you've got a teenage boy who probably gets a boner off a gust of wind. He's bound to be wanking like a chimp thinking about the matrons. And he then goes on to explain that the matrons would assist the youngest boys with a nightly wash, and older boys who'd reached puberty had a separate room behind a yellow door, and the matrons came along and basically shampooed the boys and eased back his head and gave him a luxurious rinse. And he describes it as confusing as hell, but doesn't expand on why it was. So I'm not sure whether it's the case that he was developing sort of lust and sexual feelings for his matrons at the same time they were there just to clean them. He doesn't really expand on why that is. We're then explained that they were involved in dealing with lice because outbreaks were common. And then as a 13-year-old, he moved from the bathing assistants to a nightly tuck-in and morning greetings. And it's clear that when he wakes up, he explains he looks into this beautiful visage framed by a halo of sun and obviously thinks that it might be his mother. He then explains that he dealt with a matron called Pat, and Pat wasn't hot. She was cold and small and mousy and frazzled, and her hair fell greasily into her always tired eyes. And it would seem that he found that it would be the case that only the newest and stupidest boys would go to Pat with a problem, or worse, a cut. She wouldn't bandage it, she'd poke it with a finger or squirt something into it that hurt twice as much. She wasn't a sadist, she just seemed empathy challenged. And he talked about the fact of her various ailments and the fact that she'd move rather slowly, so she would be tormented by the boys, and it would appear that he took considerable delight in doing this because he basically saw her as moving very slowly and they would all move rather fastly and they would mock her. And the reason he said that he was mocking her wasn't so much to torment her, but because it made his friends laugh, and it felt good in order to cause his friends to laugh, that he found some delight in doing that. So there's a little bit of an explanation of what life was like at school there, and then he moves on telling us about something called Grub Days, which is when the treats were received, various types of sweets, and he talks about the great offence that he took when Opal Fruits changed their name to Starburst. And he would say about how everybody would go running over and have lots of sweets crammed into their mouth, and then they all looked forward to that. But then what he didn't look forward to was letter writing day, and he explained that it was difficult when writing to his parents because he couldn't remember when they weren't divorced, and writing to them meant about touching on their mutual grievances. So he gives an example of this. Dear Pa, how's Mummy? No. Dear Mummy, Pa says you haven't. No. And then once his mother had died, he said that it was impossible for him to do it. He says that he has a vague memory of protesting against being told to write a final letter to his mother, and he thinks that he probably dashed off there was something pro forma, just getting it out of the way, and that was that. And he makes reference to saying that he wished he had taken it a little more seriously than he actually did. He then moves on and explains that half-term comes along and he was going home, but oh no, apparently he wasn't, because apparently his dad didn't want him at St. James's Palace, where he'd been living mainly following the breakup, and it's where William and him had lived when it was their time with their father. And apparently Charles was concerned about what Harry might get up to at St. James's Palace. And interestingly, he claims, I don't know how he knows this, but he says that he feared that Harry would be photographed in the gardens or through a window and would get questions from reporters. And also it was decided, therefore, that he would take Harry with him on a trip to South Africa. Apparently he had a meeting with Nelson Mandela and the Spice Girls, and Harry was rather thrilled about this. And the Spice Girls were there because they were doing a concert. And he then makes reference to the fact that the idea was, of course, to get Charles some good headlines, which he sorely needed, by being alongside Nelson Mandela as a revered political leader and, of course, at the time, a very popular band. And he makes reference to the fact that since Diana's death, or as he puts it, since Mummy's disappearance, which is interesting, because it almost seems as though he still hasn't accepted that she's actually dead. And he talks about the fact that his father's approval ratings were really low and that people had blamed him for the divorce, and he didn't care about the reason for the trip. That's Harry. He was content to get away from Britain, and he felt that it would be some time with his father, who he felt had been checked out. And he explains that his father hadn't always been so checked out, but it was a talk about how he didn't really appear ready for parenthood, and that he was a proud man, but he wasn't made out for single parenthood. And he explained that his father did try, and he would always come in, and apparently Charles wouldn't forget that Harry didn't like the dark, so he'd gently tickle his face until he fell asleep. And he says he has the fondest memories of his hands on my cheeks, my forehead, then waking up to find him gone. Magically, the door always considerately left open a crack. But other than those moments, he said that they really just coexisted. And he'd find a letter from his father placed on his pillow, saying how proud he was of him. And he talks about how the Spice Girls concert was his first public appearance since the funeral. And thereafter, he talked about the fact that he was next to Baby Spice, and apparently she kept pinching his cheeks, and Posh Spice clutched his hand, and then he saw Ginger Spice, the only one with whom he felt any connection, because she was a fellow ginger. And she was world famous for wearing the mini dress made out of the Union Jack, again its Union flag. And he noticed that there were questions coming from the journalists, and again this shows his paranoia, as he states, questions that weren't questions that were traps, questions that were flung at my head like cleavers. The journalists didn't give a toss how I was doing. They were trying to get me to say something messy, newsy. Well, he might be right about that, or is this unnecessarily cynical for a 13-year-old boy? Or again, is this older Harry imprinting his own views on younger Harry? I think it probably is. He explained that he smiled and the photographs were taken, and then into the concert he went, and found it rather entertainingly that he saw his dad nodding along to the beat and tapping his foot to the Spice Girls. And then on the way out, he explains that they were caught again by the press, and on this occasion he grabbed his father's hand and hung on. And he writes, I recall, blight as the flashes, loving him, needing him. Again, in these early stages about his life, the narrative that we have in respect of what he believes and views of the press, it's difficult really to accept that a 13-year-old boy would necessarily form those views about the press, and one cannot help but think that this is what Harry feels now being imposed upon there. It's less flowery, the writing here, compared to the earlier parts. More bum bum bum, this happened, that happened, and so forth, with some feeling, and it moves along at quite a pace in terms of funeral, mother dies, funeral takes place, then I'm back to school, then I'm off to a Spice Girls concert in South Africa. And interestingly, there's very little mention of William. And this is probably because with William being at Eton, he didn't see a lot of him. And it's clear as well that he criticises his father's parenting skills, and it's evident that he's in this numbed state but missing his mother and unable in a way to process what has actually happened. All of this is quite useful to see because it's teeing up many of the things that created his vulnerability for what comes later on, and we'll see undoubtedly how Harry's wife took advantage of this young individual. It demonstrates as well that the things that made him happy, making other people laugh, being a bit of a japester and a jokester, playing on the Xbox, fairly straightforward things. But the taint that appears with regard to the press very much seems like an adult thing that's been injected after the event. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.